Welcome back. I was reviewing this particular script when something specific stopped me cold. Not the betrayal itself, but the method Nathan Cole used to answer it. He never raised his voice. He never sent a single confrontational text. He simply knew where the bodies were buried in the balance sheets, and he waited. You're watching His Eternal Diary.
The first thing Nathan Cole noticed when he regained consciousness was the smell of antiseptic and old coffee. The particular combination that no amount of money could scrub from a hospital corridor. It came through the gap under his door in slow waves, mixing with the faint copper taste still living somewhere at the back of his throat. He lay there for a long moment without moving, after cataloging sensations the way he'd trained himself to do in the field. The pressure of the IV line taped to the back of his left hand, the dull architectural weight of bandaging across his right shoulder and chest. The sound of a monitor beside him keeping time with a patience he no longer shared. 41 days. He would learn that number an hour later from a soft-voiced nurse named Patricia, who didn't meet his eyes when she said it. 41 days in a medically induced coma, while the bullet that had entered through the upper right quadrant of his chest did its damage, and then allowed itself to be removed. The surgical team at Hargrove Memorial had, by all accounts, performed something close to a miracle. The bullet had traveled 3 centimeters from his subclavian artery. 3 centimeters between Nathan Cole and an obituary that would have read survived by no immediate family, which was accurate and beloved by many. One which would have been a lie constructed by people who barely remembered his name at events where his presence had kept them safe. He asked Patricia for water. She brought it. He drank it slowly and stared at the water-stained ceiling tile directly above his bed, and began, methodically, to reconstruct the evening of November the 14th. The Caldwell Foundation Gala at the Dorset Hotel. Black tie. Of 400 guests on the 42nd floor, in a ballroom with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked west over the city, and made everyone inside feel briefly untouchable. Nathan had been there in 2 capacities that night, a distinction that the evening's hosts had never been required to understand. Officially, he was the guest of Serena Ashworth, daughter of Senator Victor Ashworth, or a relationship that had existed for 2 years and 9 months, and occupied a curious middle territory where it was real enough to have its own rhythm, its own private language, its own drawer in his apartment, but never quite defined enough to withstand public scrutiny. Unofficially, Nathan ran the private risk assessment firm that had managed Senator Ashworth's personal security detail for the previous 18 months. A contract that had been structured carefully through a subsidiary so that Serena could continue to introduce him at galas as simply Nathan, without the awkwardness of also introducing him as the man her father paid to assess threats. It was an arrangement that had required Nathan to build a particular skill. The ability to be present in 2 registers simultaneously. To hold a glass of Bordeaux and maintain comfortable conversation about architecture and emerging markets, while a separate, as quieter part of his mind tracked entry points, monitored body language in his peripheral vision, and maintained a real-time probability calculation for the threat level in any given room. He had been good at it. He had, if he was being precise about it, been exceptional at it, which was why the events of November the 14th had unfolded the way they did. The shot had come from the service corridor that ran behind the east wall of the ballroom, and accessed through a door that security had cleared twice that evening. The door had been compromised during the caterer's second run, a 30-second window that Nathan had flagged to his secondary operative as a potential concern. His secondary operative, a former military contractor named James Okafor, had moved to address it. He had been 2 steps short when the door opened. The shooter had not been targeting Senator Ashworth. said Nathan had understood this in the fraction of a second available to him before he moved. The angle was wrong for the senator. The trajectory from that service corridor, given the relative positions of everyone in that ballroom at that precise moment, placed the center of the shooting line not at Victor Ashworth, but at Serena. His mind had processed this and produced a singular response with no deliberation required. He moved his body in front of hers. Tom, the bullet entered through the right side of his chest, while Serena was still holding a glass of white wine. He remembered the impact. He did not remember anything after it until the moment he woke to the smell of antiseptic and Patricia's careful voice telling him 41 days, as though it were a weather report. What he did not know yet, lying in that bed with the IV and the monitor and the water-stained ceiling tile, was that in those 41 days, whilst the world had continued its rotation without any particular concern for what he had sacrificed, he would learn the rest of it over the following 72 hours. Serena came on the second day of his consciousness. She arrived at 11 in the morning wearing a cream-colored coat he hadn't seen before and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that she'd always preferred to hospital coffee. And she set one on his bedside table with the care of someone who understood small gestures, and she sat in the chair beside his bed and held his left hand with both of hers and looked at him with an expression he spent a considerable amount of time afterward attempting to accurately name. It was not guilt. He had seen guilt on people's faces, and it had a specific architecture. A particular way of pulling at the corners of the eyes and compressing the lips. But what Serena wore was something adjacent to grief, which suggested that she was mourning something, but grief for what was a question she didn't answer directly. She told him he looked better than she'd expected. She told him that the surgical team had been remarkable, and that her father had ensured he had the best possible care. She told him that she had visited twice during the coma, which he verified against Patricia's sign-in log later that afternoon. Twice in 41 days, and he noted this without expression. She held his hand for 37 minutes. He knew the duration because the monitor beside him had a clock in its lower corner that he watched with the detached focus of a man who had recently relearned the value of precision. Near the end of the visit, she said something that he would return to many times in the weeks that followed, turning it over in his mind the way you turn a stone to look at what lives under it. She said, "I need you to be patient with me." "Oh, Nathan, I need a little more time. When you're out of here and you're healthy, we'll sort everything out properly. We'll do this the right way." He had understood those words, at the time, as a promise. He would not make that interpretive error again. She kissed him on the forehead before she left. He lay still and watched the door close behind her, and then turned his attention back to the ceiling tile and began the slow, careful process of updating his understanding of the situation. She did not visit again. The rehabilitation facility that received him 6 weeks later was a clean, well-lit space in the northern part of the city, the kind of place that had oak panels in the hallways and motivational phrases in tasteful fonts on the walls, the kind of phrases that Nathan had always found to be written by people who had never actually needed motivating. Yet he had a room with a window that looked out over a small courtyard where some of the longer-term residents sat in the afternoons. He did his physical therapy with the methodical attention he brought to everything, relearning the range of motion in his right shoulder, building back the lung capacity that the surgical repair had compromised. He ate the food. He slept the requisite hours. He also, in the quiet time between scheduled activities, began to read. And the financial press had always been part of his professional practice. When you assessed corporate risk, you read the financial press the way a doctor read charts, looking not for the headline but for the anomaly, the number that didn't align, the acquisition that happened 6 weeks before a regulatory announcement, the executive departure that was framed as retirement but timed against a forensic audit. Nathan had developed, over 8 years in the field, as an almost involuntary sensitivity to these patterns. It was the kind of skill that looks like intuition from the outside, but is actually the accumulated residue of 10,000 hours of careful attention. He was 3 weeks into rehabilitation, reading a Tuesday morning copy of the financial supplement on a tablet propped against his coffee cup, when he found the item in the corporate announcements section. It was brief. Hale Industries. Hale, the mid-sized conglomerate founded by the late Richard Hale and currently led by his son, Dominic Hale, had announced a significant expansion of its real estate development portfolio through a new partnership with Ashworth Capital, the private investment vehicle controlled by Senator Victor Ashworth. The partnership was structured through a newly incorporated entity called Crestline Development Group and was valued at a reported $240 million. Nathan read the item twice. Then he set down the tablet and looked at his coffee, and remained very still for a moment that lasted longer than it appeared to from the outside. Ashworth Capital. He knew that entity well. He had, as part of the risk assessment work he'd done for the senator's office, reviewed its structure on 2 separate occasions. It was a privately held vehicle, incorporated in Delaware with operational offices in the city, and it had a board of 2, Victor Ashworth and Serena Ashworth. Serena had been added to the board 14 months ago, a structural decision that Victor had described to Nathan at the time as estate planning, ensuring Serena had visibility into the family's financial architecture. Nathan had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought considerably more of it now. He pulled up the corporate registry for Crestline Development Group on his tablet. The filing was 11 days old. The registered directors were listed as Dominic Hale and Serena Ashworth, and he set the tablet down again. Outside the window, an older man in the courtyard was feeding a sparrow from his palm with the careful patience of someone who had learned not to rush small things. Nathan poured himself fresh coffee from the carafe on his bedside table. He drank it slowly. He did not send any messages that day. He began, instead, to compile a list. The list was not written down. He was too careful for that. It existed in the organized architecture of his memory, which had always been his most reliable instrument. The list was simple in its structure: what he knew, what he suspected, what he needed to verify, and what he intended to do with it. What he knew: Serena Ashworth was now a co-director of a $240 million development entity with Dominic Hale. The entity had been incorporated while Nathan was in rehabilitation. The announcement had come without any direct communication from Serena. The last time Serena had spoken to him was the 37-minute hospital visit with the careful forehead kiss. He had not heard from her since. What he suspected: a great many things that he preferred not to name yet, because in his professional experience there was a category error in naming suspicions before the evidence warranted it. It created a motivated reasoning problem. You started interpreting every piece of information in light of the conclusion you'd already reached, which meant you missed the disconfirming evidence and compounded your errors. He had made that mistake once, in a corporate security assessment in his early career, and the resulting miscalculation had cost a client 3 weeks and a considerable amount of professional embarrassment. He had not made it again. What he needed to verify: the timeline, the structure of the new entity, the relationship between Dominic Hale and Serena Ashworth that predated or postdated his own hospitalization, and whether there were any other corporate filings, communications, or public records that would allow him to establish a clearer picture. What he intended to do with it, he did not yet know. He was content not to know. In his experience, the answer to that question had a way of becoming clear once the picture was complete. He spent the following week reading. He requested an upgrade to the rehabilitation facility's internet subscription, citing professional necessity, at which the administrator granted with the mild puzzlement of someone who had never encountered a patient interested in corporate registry filings. He went through every public record attached to Hale Industries that he could access from a tablet. Annual filings, directorship changes, regulatory submissions, the 2 press releases related to the Crestline partnership, and the one item in a city business journal that had covered the announcement with slightly more detail than the financial supplement. The journal piece mentioned, in its 4th paragraph, that Dominic Hale and Serena Ashworth had been long-standing friends who had been seen together at several industry events over the past year. The journalist had treated this as background color. Nathan treated it as a data point. He cross-referenced it against his own memory of the previous year. At the events he had attended with Serena, the events she had attended without him, citing family obligations or industry commitments. He began to build a parallel timeline, placing Dominic Hale's name at the points where Serena had been present in the city without Nathan, and running that timeline against the public records of Hale Industries events and the senator's official calendar, which was partially accessible through public records requests. By the end of the week, when he had a picture that was incomplete, but structurally coherent, and the structure was not flattering to anyone in it. He was 4 weeks into rehabilitation when he woke one morning and reached for his tablet and found, through no particular effort, because it was the kind of thing that the financial press covered when there was nothing more significant to write about, a social column item in the weekend supplement of the city's main broadsheet. The item was accompanied by a photograph. It showed Dominic Hale at a charity auction, a tall man in his mid-30s with the careful grooming of someone who had grown up understanding that appearance was a form of capital. He was standing beside a woman in a dark green dress who was laughing at something off camera. The woman was Serena. The caption identified her as Serena Ashworth, described the event as a fundraiser for urban housing initiatives, noted Dominic Hale's recent corporate expansion, and mentioned in its final clause that the two had recently confirmed a personal relationship. Nathan put the tablet face down on the blanket and looked at the courtyard. The older man was there again, without the sparrow this time, sitting with his hands folded in his lap and his face turned toward the pale morning sky, with an expression of such complete and undefended peace that Nathan found it, for reasons he didn't examine closely, briefly unbearable to look at. But he turned away and picked up his tablet again and continued reading. 40 days after that, on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, Nathan was in the common room of the rehabilitation facility for his scheduled socialization hour, a requirement he had always found to be one of the program's more optimistic inventions, when one of the aides changed the television channel to a local news broadcast and the screen filled with an exterior shot of the Cathedral of St. James on the east side of the city, and the chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Hale Ashworth Wedding. City's prominent families unite. He watched it from across the room. He was sitting in a chair beside a window with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. On the screen, the camera cut to a series of street-level shots of guests arriving. Then it cut to a still photograph, clearly provided by a publicist, of Serena in a white gown standing beside Dominic Hale in a morning coat. Both of them arranged with the composed expressions of people who had been professionally advised on the precise degree of happiness appropriate for a formal announcement. She was holding a white calla lily. Nathan observed this. He drank his lukewarm coffee. Another patient in the common room made a comment about the dress. One of the aides said something about the family. Nathan set his cup down, stood, and walked back to his room at his normal pace. He sat on the edge of his bed, And he did not engage in any of the internal narrative performances that this moment might have been expected to generate. He did not construct a mental catalog of all the moments that had preceded it, or assign them new meaning in the light of this development. He was a man who had been shot in the chest and had spent 3 months in a bed relearning the basic physics of his own body, and he was not prepared to spend a single further unit of energy on anything that didn't serve a specific, incalculable purpose. What he did instead was reach for his tablet and open a new note. He titled it Professional Projects, which was accurate. He began to type. The note was not a revenge plan. He would object to that framing, if pressed, because revenge implied an emotional transaction, a need to feel the other party's pain in some proportion to his own, a theater of suffering conducted for the benefit of the person who had been wronged. Nathan did not need any of that. But what he needed was something considerably more concrete and considerably less forgiving. Structural correction. He had spent 8 years in corporate risk assessment. Before that, he had spent 4 years in financial audit, a period that had left him with 2 durable skills. The first was the ability to read a balance sheet the way other people read a novel, tracking not just the stated numbers but the relationships between them. The places where the narrative strained under the weight of what it was trying to conceal. The second was a specific, granular knowledge of the regulatory architecture governing private investment vehicles in his state, a knowledge he had deepened over the subsequent years of risk work, until it was not merely professional expertise, but something closer to an internal map. He knew this map well. He knew, for instance, that Ashworth Capital, as a privately held investment vehicle with a board of only 2 directors, was subject to a specific set of fiduciary obligations that applied to all transactions above a defined threshold. He knew that the Crestline Development Group Incorporation had been filed at a point when one of Ashworth Capital's 2 directors, specifically Serena Ashworth, was simultaneously a party to a personal relationship with the other newly incorporated entity's primary director, specifically Dominic Hale, as a relationship that the social column had confirmed predated the filing. He knew that under state law, specifically under the provisions of the Uniform Fiduciary Income and Principal Act as adopted with amendments in this jurisdiction, a director of a privately held investment vehicle who entered into a significant joint venture with a party with whom they had an undisclosed personal financial interest was required to make a specific disclosure to the vehicle's other directors and, in certain circumstances, to the vehicle's beneficial interest holders. He knew that this disclosure had not been made. He knew because he had, very quietly, requested the Ashworth Capital governance documentation through a channel that would not raise flags, specifically through a former audit colleague now working at the state's financial regulatory body, a request framed as background research for a professional development seminar that Nathan was ostensibly planning. As the documents had arrived in his email 3 days later, he had read them 3 times. He also knew something that existed outside the formal documentation, something he had learned during the 18 months he had managed security for the senator's office and had, at the time, noted as a professional curiosity without any particular intention of acting on it. Hale Industries had a problem. The problem was not visible in its filed accounts. That was, in a sense, the nature of the problem. Nathan had encountered Dominic Hale professionally once, 18 months earlier, at a security briefing related to a joint development project that Hale Industries had proposed to one of Nathan's other clients. In preparation for that briefing, Nathan had done a standard corporate background check on Hale Industries, the kind of check that looked not just at public filings, but at the subsidiary structure, the intercompany transactions, and the pattern of acquisitions. What he had found in that check had not been his concern at the time. His mandate was physical security, not financial compliance, and the anomalies he'd observed in Hale Industries' subsidiary structure were not his client's problem in any direct sense. He had noted them in his internal records and moved on. The anomalies were specific. Hale Industries had, over the previous 4 years, made a series of acquisitions of small residential development sites through a chain of entities that terminated in a Delaware holding company called Meridian Property Holdings, LLC. The acquisitions were individually small enough to fall below the mandatory disclosure threshold for a company of Hale Industries' public profile. The cumulative value of those acquisitions, when added together, was approximately $87 million. The acquiring entities in each transaction were different. He connected to Hale Industries only through a layered structure of ownership that required 3 or 4 steps to trace. The $87 million had never appeared in any clearly identifiable form in Hale Industries' consolidated accounts. That was a problem of a specific kind that had a specific name in Nathan's professional vocabulary. It was the kind of problem that, if brought to the attention of the correct regulatory body with the correct documentation, it created a particular category of consequence for the individuals responsible for it, a consequence that operated slowly and very thoroughly and did not care about wedding photographs or mourning coats or white calla lilies. He had never brought it to anyone's attention. There had been no reason to. There was now. He was released from the rehabilitation facility on a Thursday morning in early March, carrying a small bag and a discharge summary and the physiotherapist's note that his shoulder had recovered to approximately 93% of its pre-injury range of motion, which the physiotherapist had described as excellent. Nathan had said thank you and meant it, and walked out into weather that was still cold enough to see his breath. He took a cab to his apartment, which his building superintendent had maintained in his absence with an efficiency Nathan had always found reassuring. So he stood in the middle of his living room for a moment, recalibrating to the space. The apartment was clean, slightly impersonal in the way that spaces become when they are inhabited by someone who has always treated them primarily as operational bases rather than homes. There was a gray couch. There was a bookcase arranged by subject matter. There was, on the kitchen counter, the mocha pot that he had been using every morning for 6 years, cleaned and waiting. He made coffee, and he sat at his desk and opened his laptop, and he began the work that he had been planning in the careful architecture of his memory for the past 2.5 months. The first call he made was to Elena Voss. Elena was 44, a forensic accountant who had spent 8 years at a Big Four firm before leaving to build a boutique practice that specialized in one thing: finding money that had been structured to disappear. She had a reputation in the professional community that was described, depending on who you asked, as either surgical or merciless, both of which Nathan regarded as compliments. He had worked with her twice before, on corporate security assignments where the financial and physical risk elements overlapped, and he had found her to be the cleanest professional thinker he had encountered in his field. She did not speculate. She followed the architecture. She answered on the second ring. "Nathan Cole," she said. "I heard you were dead." "I was close," he said. "I need your time on something." "How much time?" 3 months, possibly 4. It's a full structure analysis. "Corporate or personal?" "Both. They've been deliberately conflated." There was a pause on the line. He heard the sound of her setting something down, the small click of a glass against a desk surface. "What's the subject entity?" "Hale Industries," he said, "and a subsidiary chain terminating in a Delaware LLC called Meridian Property Holdings, and a connected private investment vehicle called Ashworth Capital." Another pause, slightly longer. "I've heard of Hale Industries." Most people have. And Ashworth Capital. Her voice carried no particular inflection. That's the senator's vehicle. It is. Nathan. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need a straight answer before I agree to anything. Go ahead. Is this personal? He considered the question with the same seriousness with which she had asked it. There's a personal element in the origin, he said. There's no personal element in the method. I'm not asking you to build a narrative. I'm asking you to follow the architecture. She was quiet for another 3 seconds. Send me what you have. I'll tell you whether there's a case. He sent her the documents that afternoon, and the incorporation filings, the subsidiary structure chart he had rebuilt from public records during his rehabilitation, the Ashworth Capital Governance documentation, and one additional item that he had not mentioned yet, a USB drive's worth of material that he had assembled from the 18-month period during which his firm had held the security contract for the senator's office, specifically the financial documents that had passed through the office during that period for purposes adjacent to Nathan's security mandate, and that Nathan had, with his characteristic thoroughness, retained in encrypted backup as a matter of professional practice. He was aware of the legal architecture around that retention. He had consulted a corporate attorney, specifically one named David Park, who practiced out of a small firm in the financial district and who had a specialty in evidence law, the previous week by phone. David Park had confirmed, after a careful review of the specific circumstances, that the retention was defensible on specific grounds that he outlined in a follow-up email that Nathan read 4 times and then saved in 3 separate encrypted locations. He was not a man who moved without cover. Elena called back in 48 hours. There's a case, she said, with the flat certainty of a structural engineer confirming that a building would fall. A significant one. Nathan poured himself a glass of water and sat down. Walk me through it. The Meridian structure is a textbook parking scheme, Elena said. The acquisitions are individually small because they've been specifically calibrated to stay below the disclosure threshold. The aggregate value is $87 million, which you already knew. But what you may not have seen is that the acquisition prices on 4 of the 17 sites are materially above market rate. We're talking between 12 and 31% above the independently assessed values at the time of acquisition. The difference between the acquisition prices and the market values on those 4 sites is $22 million. Nathan was quiet. That $22 million moved through a series of intercompany transfers, Elena continued. And it terminates in a personal account in the name of a Richard Hale family trust. Richard Hale is Dominic Hale's deceased father. The trust's current sole beneficiary is Dominic Hale. So Hale Industries overpaid for 4 development sites, Nathan said. And the difference went into Dominic Hale's personal trust. That's the architecture. The technical term for that depends on whether Hale Industries is publicly listed, which it isn't. But the investor base for the development projects includes 3 institutional investors who each hold a preferred equity position, which means the overpayment represents a direct breach of fiduciary duty to those investors. The potential exposure is significant. What's the regulatory body? The State Securities Commission has jurisdiction over the investor side of it. Now, the IRS has interest in the trust transfers because 2 of the 4 acquisitions crossed the relevant tax year boundary in a way that affected the deductible loss profile for the acquiring entities. She paused. There's also a state AG angle on the false valuations, depending on how motivated the office is. Given the senator connection, I'd expect them to be motivated. And Ashworth Capital. That's more straightforward, but potentially more publicly damaging because of the senator's profile. Cuts. The Crestline Incorporation happened at a point when Serena Ashworth was in an undisclosed personal relationship with the counterparty director. The governance documentation you provided shows that no conflict disclosure was made to Victor Ashworth as the other director. Under the Uniform Fiduciary Act provisions, that's a material breach. The senator's name is on the founding documents. His exposure depends on what he knew and when. He knew, Nathan said. Elena was quiet for a moment. You have documentation of that? I have documentation of a conversation. When? 6 days before the Crestline filing. She let out a slow breath. Nathan, what kind of documentation? A meeting summary from the senator's security briefing calendar for that date. The briefing was attended by the senator, Serena Ashworth, and Dominic Hale. The subject of the briefing was recorded in the senator's own administrative system, as Crestline Development Group Preliminary Structure Discussion. And you have that from the security access documentation. I have it from the security access documentation. She was quiet for a few seconds. If you bring this to the right people correctly, the senator has a problem. I'm aware. I want to be clear about my role, Elena said. I build the financial forensics case. I don't decide where it goes. That's understood. I'll make the decisions about where it goes. And Nathan. Her voice carried a specific quality that he had learned, in their 2 previous engagements, to read as the professional equivalent of a warning flare. When I said there's a significant case, I meant significant in a bilateral sense. This goes forward, it doesn't stay neat. It touches the senator's office. It touches the marriage. It touches things you may not want touched. I know exactly what it touches, he said. Send me your engagement letter. I'll have it back to you by Friday. He sent it back on Thursday. The following 3 months were the calmest period Nathan had experienced since the morning of the gala. This surprised him initially. He had expected to feel the acceleration that characterized the operational phase of any professional project, the particular quality of attention that came with active engagement. And instead what he found was something closer to the stillness of someone who has already calculated the trajectory and is simply waiting for the physics to play out. He ran his regular business. He managed his existing security contracts through the subsidiary structure he had maintained during the hospitalization, which his 2 senior operatives, including Okafor, had kept functioning with a professionalism he was grateful for. He exercised every morning, rebuilding the shoulder to 100% over 8 weeks, at which point the physiotherapist sent a follow-up note that Nathan filed without reading because he had already known his shoulder was back to full function for 3 weeks prior. He ate well. He slept adequately. He did not contact Serena. He did not contact Senator Ashworth. He did not contact Dominic Hale. This required no particular discipline. He had learned in his years of professional work, yet that the most effective posture during the preparation phase of any significant project was what he thought of as operational invisibility, the complete absence of any signal that would allow the subject to prepare their defenses. Every communication he sent or withheld, every meeting he attended or declined, every public appearance he made or avoided was calculated against the single criterion of maintaining that invisibility until the moment it was no longer needed. He did have one meeting with David Park, the corporate attorney, in the 2nd month. It was held in Park's office rather than Nathan's, a choice Nathan had made for reasons of operational hygiene, and it ran for 3 hours over 2 sessions on consecutive days. The meeting covered the mechanics of how the Hale Industries material would be submitted, which regulatory bodies would receive it first, and what the timing sequence should be to maximize the structural pressure and minimize the risk of early containment. David Park was a small, unhurried man who wore reading glasses that he perpetually forgot were pushed up on his forehead, and who had, in Nathan's assessment, one of the most precise legal minds he had encountered outside of formal legal proceedings. And he had reviewed Elena's forensic analysis and the supporting documentation with the sustained attention of someone reading a manuscript they expected to be published and was looking for errors before it went to print. "The Hale Industries piece is airtight if the forensics hold," Park said. "And if Elena Voss is signing off on the forensics, they hold." "I'm not asking about whether they hold," Nathan said. "I'm asking about sequence." Park nodded. "Securities Commission first. So they have the cleanest jurisdictional basis and the fastest investigative timeline once they receive a compliant submission. You want them moving before the IRS side develops its own independent momentum, because the securities side will pull public attention and create the pressure environment that limits Hale's options for settlement." "What about the senator?" Park removed his glasses from his face and turned them in his hands for a moment. The AG angle on the senator is a function of timing and political appetite. You submit the Ashworth Capital Conflict Disclosure breach to the state, AG simultaneously with the Securities Commission submission. Whether the AG's office pursues it aggressively depends on factors outside our control. Specifically, whether the senator has any current political rivals who find it useful to encourage pursuit. He has several. Then I'd expect the AG's office to find the appetite. Park put his glasses back on. "Nathan, I want to revisit one element. The personal relationship documentation, the calendar entry showing the Crestline pre-filing meeting. That's your most sensitive piece of material because of the provenance question." "You've reviewed the provenance analysis." "I have. But my concern isn't legal. It's tactical. If Ashworth's attorneys challenge the provenance, and the challenge generates coverage before the Securities Commission submission lands, you've given Hale's side time to prepare a containment narrative." Nathan had considered this. The Securities Commission submission doesn't rely on the calendar entry. Elena's forensics stand alone on the Hale Industries side. The calendar entry is relevant only to the senator's personal exposure on the Crestline conflict breach. I can sequence them separately. Securities Commission receives the Hale forensics in week 1. Ashworth Capital conflict disclosure goes to the AG in week 4, after the Hale story has already broken. Park looked at him over his glasses for a moment. "That's a clean sequence." "I know. And you're aware that by week 4, the Hale story breaking will have already created significant media coverage that will touch Serena Ashworth by association." "I'm aware." "You're comfortable with that?" Nathan looked at him steadily. "She's a director of the entity. Her professional exposure is a function of her professional choices." Park nodded once, slowly, with the expression of a man who had asked the question he needed to ask, and received an answer that satisfied the professional requirement, whatever it left unaddressed on the personal side. He picked up his pen. "Let's finalize the submission documents." The submissions went in on a Tuesday morning in late May. Nathan sent them from his apartment, from a laptop connected to a dedicated encrypted line through the electronic submission portals of the relevant regulatory bodies. He had formatted the packages according to each body's specific submission requirements, which he had reviewed 3 times. Elena's forensic analysis was attached as the primary exhibit in the Securities Commission package. The supporting documentation ran to 462 pages. He closed the laptop and made coffee, and stood by his window looking at the street below. It was a clear morning. The city was running its normal Tuesday. A delivery truck was double-parked outside the building across the street. 2 people were having an animated conversation outside the coffee shop on the corner, and their hands moving with the expressiveness of people who were making a point they considered important. A dog was pulling its owner toward a particular section of gutter with the absolute conviction of an entity for whom that gutter represented the single most compelling feature of the entire morning. Nathan watched this for a while. Then he went back to his desk and opened his emails and answered the three that required attention from his regular professional work. The Securities Commission acknowledged receipt 3 days later with a standard automated response. Elena called that afternoon. "I've been contacted by a commission staff attorney asking to schedule a preliminary technical discussion," she said. "They're moving." "How fast?" "Faster than standard. The size of the numbers pulls immediate attention." He had expected as much. "Keep me updated." "Nathan?" She paused. The staff attorney mentioned that they'd already cross-referenced with an existing investigation." He was quiet for a moment. "An existing investigation into Hale Industries?" "Into the Meridian structure specifically. It looks like the commission had a preliminary flag on it from a separate source. Our submission gave them enough to formalize it into a full investigation." He processed this. Yet it confirmed something he had suspected, that the Meridian structure had generated regulatory concern prior to his submission, possibly from one of the 3 institutional investors who held preferred equity positions and whose analysts would have flagged the same anomalies. His submission had not created the problem. It had simply accelerated the timeline on a problem that had already been building. He found this information technically satisfying. So the first press story appeared in the financial press 11 days after his submission. It was brief and carefully sourced, clearly from the Securities Commission's standard procedure of notifying a company of an investigation before it became public, giving the company's communications team the window to prepare a response. The response was a single paragraph from Hale Industries' media representative describing the investigation as routine and expressing confidence in the company's compliance record. Nathan read it over his morning coffee. He assessed it as the response of a communications team that had been given 48 hours to prepare and had not been given the specific scope of the investigation by their attorneys, which suggested that the attorneys were still assessing the scope themselves. And the second press story appeared 4 days later and was considerably less brief. It ran in the broadsheet's business section under a headline that described the Securities Commission investigation as encompassing alleged irregularities in Hale Industries' development acquisition program. And it included, in its 6th paragraph, the observation that the aggregate value of the acquisitions under scrutiny was approximately $87 million. And the story quoted an anonymous institutional source describing concerns about pricing and value discrepancy. Hale Industries stock, which was held through a listed parent entity in which Dominic Hale maintained a 31% personal stake, declined 8% that day. Nathan noted this without particular satisfaction. The stock price was a secondary effect. The primary effect was the investigation itself. And the investigation was now self-sustaining in the hands of the regulatory body, which was where he had always intended to deliver it. He submitted the Ashworth Capital Conflict Disclosure Package to the State AG's office on the 28th day following the initial Securities Commission submission, exactly as he had planned. He had no contact from the AG's office in the 2 weeks that followed, which was normal. These things moved at their own pace once they were in motion, which was a quality Nathan had always found to be one of the regulatory process's most useful features. The third major press story ran in the 4th week, and it was the first to mention the Ashworth connection. It was a longer piece, clearly the product of several days of reporting, and it traced the ownership structure of Crestline Development Group from its public corporate filing, noting the co-directorship of Serena Ashworth and her role as a board member of Ashworth Capital. As the story did not allege any specific misconduct, it raised questions in the measured language of careful financial journalism and provided context that was, in its totality, unflattering. Senator Victor Ashworth's office released a statement that day describing his daughter as a private individual whose business activities were entirely her own and expressing the senator's full confidence in the regulatory process. The statement was, by Nathan's reading, the statement of a man whose communication staff had been given 30 minutes and a directive not to say anything that could be used in a subsequent investigation. He read it twice. He thought about the senator, whom he had known for 18 months, and whom he had assessed, during that period, as a man of considerable intelligence, who had always treated Nathan with the specific brand of studied cordiality that senior politicians extended to people they found useful but not quite important. He thought about the meeting on November the 14th, before the gala. He thought about the senator's hand on his shoulder as they'd reviewed the security plan for the evening, and the particular warmth in the senator's voice as he said, "I trust you with her completely, Nathan," which had been the most sincere thing the senator had said to him in 18 months, and which Nathan now read, with the clarity of distance, as not as an expression of faith in Nathan specifically, but as an expression of the senator's confidence that his interests were comprehensively covered, from every relevant direction, by the arrangements he had made. He set the statement down. He felt nothing that required examination. The call from Serena came on a Thursday afternoon in the 6th week, following the initial submission. He was in his car, returning from a client meeting, when her name appeared on the dashboard display. He looked at it for a moment. He answered, "Nathan." Her voice was the same. He had not expected that to register, and it registered. "Serena, I need to speak with you." She had never been a person who prefaced things with pleasantries when she was under pressure. He had once found this quality directness appealing. It remained accurate to her, in any case. "You're speaking with me now," he said. "Not like this. I need to meet." He pulled the car to the curb and put it in park. He looked at the street in front of him, a stretch of early afternoon activity that had nothing to do with either of them. "What would you like to meet about?" "Nathan, please." A pause. The specific texture of that pause told him more than whatever she was about to say. It was the pause of someone who had, very recently, updated their assessment of a situation and was still adjusting to the new landscape. "There are things happening that I need you to understand." "I understand them," he said. "But go ahead." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The investigation. The things in the press. I need you to know that I didn't, Serena." His voice was flat, not unkind, simply calibrated. "I'm not an investigator. I'm a private individual. I have nothing to do with what the Securities Commission or the AG's office chooses to investigate. You should have that conversation with your attorneys. Nathan, and I'd strongly encourage you to have it soon." He shifted the car back into drive. The forensics are complete. The regulatory processes are underway. The timeline from here is out of my hands." A silence that lasted long enough that he could hear her breathing. Then, "Was this because of the wedding?" He turned onto the avenue and considered the question with the respect that any sincere question deserved. "No," he said. "It was because of the fraud." He ended the call and turned the radio on, and drove home through late afternoon traffic that moved with the erratic, self-interested logic of a city that had somewhere to be. The call from Victor Ashworth's office came 6 days later. Not from the senator directly, but from a man who identified himself as the senator's chief of staff, and who spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had been carefully briefed on what to say, and was reading from the script with one eye on the door. The call proposed a meeting. Nathan declined. The call from Dominic Hale's attorneys came the day after, and it was a formalities call, precisely the kind he had anticipated, informing him that Hale Industries was conducting an internal review and had reason to believe that certain materials submitted to regulatory bodies had originated from sources with whom they might wish to discuss the provenance question. Nathan listened to this with the phone on speaker while he finished a section of documentation review for a separate client project. When the attorney finished, Nathan gave him the name and direct line of David Park and ended the call. David Park called that afternoon with the particular quality of calm in his voice that Nathan associated with legal professionals who were winning. Hale's attorneys want to discuss the provenance of the submission documents, Park said. We've prepared for that conversation. We have. What I want you to know that the Securities Commission staff attorney I spoke with this morning was notably uninterested in the provenance question. The forensics are their focus. The trail the forensics describe is not in dispute. Meaning that even if Hale's attorneys successfully argued that some portion of the supporting documentation was obtained through irregular means, the core forensic case stands independently. As the trail Elena Voss built from public records and the institutional investor documents alone is sufficient for the Commission's purposes. Nathan nodded to himself. He had known this, but it was useful to have it confirmed by a source other than his own judgment. And the AG's office? I spoke with a contact at the AG's office yesterday. They've opened a formal preliminary inquiry into the Crestline conflict disclosure issue, as they've subpoenaed Ashworth Capital's governance records directly. Nathan said nothing for a moment. Nathan, the subpoena covers the 3-year period prior to the Crestline filing. If the conflict issue runs deeper than the single disclosure breach, the subpoena will find it. Does it run deeper? I don't know. Do you? Nathan considered this. During the 18 months he had managed security for the senator's office, yet he had encountered one other instance of a transaction between Ashworth Capital and an entity connected to Dominic Hale. It was smaller, earlier, less clearly structured, and he had at the time attributed it to the normal financial proximity of two families in the same social and professional network, and he had not included it in his submission because the documentation was incomplete, and the inclusion of incomplete documentation in a regulatory submission was a category of error he refused to make. He told David Park about it. Park listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then said he would make a note and monitor whether the subpoena surfaced it independently. If the AG's investigators found it on their own, its impact would be twice what it would be if Nathan supplied it. This, Nathan reflected, was why he had retained David Park. The summer passed in the way that summers do when you are managing a significant professional project and also living an ordinary life adjacent to it, the 2 tracks running in parallel without quite touching, each with its own rhythm and texture. Nathan completed 2 corporate security assessments for existing clients. He hired a 3rd senior operative to cover the capacity gap that had accumulated during his hospitalization. Was that he had dinner twice with Okafor, who did not ask about the Hale Industries situation because Okafor had always been the kind of man who understood exactly which questions not to ask, which was one of the reasons Nathan had trusted him with his life at the gala and would trust him with whatever came next. He had one other meeting worth noting. In early July, he met for coffee with a woman named Catherine Marsh, a city journalist who covered financial and regulatory affairs for the broadsheet and whom he knew professionally through a previous security assignment that had touched on financial misconduct. He had reached out to her through a mutual contact with a message that was deliberately minimal. He had information relevant to the Hale Industries story that she was covering, and he was prepared to speak as a background source on a topic adjacent to the regulatory investigation. Catherine Marsh was 40, efficient, and deeply unimpressed by most things, which Nathan found restful in a professional context. She arrived at the coffee meeting 3 minutes early and ordered black coffee, and looked at him across the table, with the expression of a person who had been given a promising lead before and had learned to calibrate her enthusiasm accordingly. He gave her two things. The first was a factual account of the Ashworth Capital conflict disclosure issue, and structured as background context that she could use to build the public interest framing for a follow-up story on the AG inquiry. The second was a copy of the social column photograph of Serena and Dominic at the housing fundraiser, which he'd printed, along with the date it was taken, cross-referenced against the Crestline filing date. He gave her this not to ensure the story was written, but to ensure that if it was written accurately. Yet he had a specific professional objection to inaccurate coverage, and he was in a position to provide accurate information, so he provided it. Catherine Marsh asked him two questions. The first was whether he had a personal connection to the story. He said he had a professional familiarity with the entities involved. She accepted this without visible skepticism, which suggested she had already formed her own hypothesis about his connection, which was fine. So the second question was whether he would be willing to be named. He said no. She nodded and finished her coffee. The broadsheet story ran 3 weeks later as a long-form piece on the front page of the business section. It covered the Securities Commission investigation, the AG preliminary inquiry, and the question of the Crestline conflict disclosure structure. It included a timeline that laid out, with the precision of good financial journalism, and as the sequence of events from the Ashworth Capital Board change through the Crestline filing to the investigation. It did not name Nathan. It was entirely accurate. The story created in the professional and social community that surrounded Senator Ashworth and Dominic Hale, the specific kind of disruption that comes not from a single catastrophic event, but from the accumulation of clearly documented fact in a public format that people could read at breakfast and discuss at dinners for the following week. The disruption was not spectacular. It was quiet and thorough, and it moved through the relevant networks at its own pace, which was, in Nathan's experience, considerably more effective than spectacle. And Hale Industries' listed parent entity declined another 11% in the week following the story. 3 of the company's non-executive directors issued a joint statement calling for an independent governance review. The statement was polite, precise, and professionally lethal. Senator Ashworth's office released a longer statement that week, this one drafted clearly by a more senior communications team, as acknowledging the AG inquiry and expressing the senator's commitment to full transparency in all aspects of his private financial interests. The statement was the political equivalent of a man walking out of a burning building while insisting publicly that the building was fine. Nathan read both statements over coffee. He filed them in the Professional Projects folder. He sent Elena Voss a brief message acknowledging the progress and confirming her invoice for the following month. And he sent David Park a question about the timeline for the Securities Commission's formal findings, which Park answered within the hour. He did not feel what he supposed he might have been expected to feel at this juncture. He did not feel satisfaction, precisely. What he felt was the particular quality of stillness that comes from a piece of work completed to standard. What the specific professional cleanness of having executed a task with care and precision and seen it produce the result that the work warranted. The result was not his. It belonged to the regulatory processes and the journalism and the institutional investors and the governance reviewers and all the other mechanisms that exist in functional form because someone built them and someone uses them. Nathan had simply provided the input. The machinery had done the rest. He took a week off in August. And he drove north to a part of the coast where he had spent 2 weeks when he was 12, a stretch of gray Atlantic beach with a village at one end and nothing much at the other end, and weather that couldn't decide between rain and wind, and usually chose both. He rented a cabin from a man named Henderson, who ran the rentals as a supplement to a lobster operation, and who had the self-contained quietness of someone who had decided long ago that the ocean was sufficient company. And he walked the beach in the mornings. His shoulder performed without restriction. He ate well and slept without any of the specific insistence of a man who has to remind himself to do so, which was the first time since November that sleep had come without either effort or medicated assistance. He did not think about Serena specifically. This was not a discipline he had to maintain. It was simply a fact. He had not thought about her in the specific way, as the way that reviews and reassesses and searches for explanations and alternative interpretations since the early weeks of his hospitalization, since the morning he had looked at the water-stained ceiling tile and updated his understanding of the situation. There was nothing in the situation that had required prolonged analytical attention once its structure was clear. The structure had been clear relatively early. What he thought about? When he walked the beach on the second-to-last morning of his week off, was something simpler and more durably interesting. The nature of the work that he wanted to do going forward. He had built the risk assessment business from a specific professional foundation, and it had been good work, and the hospitalization had not changed his assessment of its quality. But the 3 months of rehabilitation had given him an unusual amount of time in which to think about what the work was for and what came next, which was not a question he had previously spent much time examining. He had, during the rehabilitation period, in parallel with the project planning, also done something that no one who knew him professionally would have predicted. He had enrolled, through an online program offered by a law school in the city, was in a certificate course in financial regulation. The course had run for 8 weeks and had required 12 hours of study per week, which he had managed by waking at 5:30 and working until 7, before physiotherapy. He had completed the course with a distinction. The certificate was not, in itself, significant. What it represented was the sharpening of a specific instrument that he intended to use differently going forward. What he had spent 8 years providing physical security for people and organizations navigating environments that were partly physically dangerous and partly financially and legally dangerous. The physical danger was the domain his clients understood and were willing to pay for. The financial and legal danger was often the larger threat and was systematically underweighted in the client's risk assessment because it was less visible and less visceral. Nathan had seen this imbalance in operation across 8 years of engagements. He had decided, in the quiet of rehabilitation, that the next phase of his professional practice would correct the imbalance. He would build a firm that handled corporate risk comprehensively. Not just the physical architecture of security, but the financial forensics, the regulatory monitoring, the legal exposure mapping. As the kind of firm that looked at a company's total threat environment and provided analysis that was operationally useful rather than simply anxiety-inducing. He had the professional network. He had the credentials, deepened now by the certificate and by the practical exercise of the past 6 months. He had the case study, which was not one he would ever use in a pitch deck, but which had demonstrated with considerable rigor that the financial forensics approach worked. He walked to the far end of the beach and back. Henderson had left coffee in a thermos on the cabin's porch table, which Nathan had come to understand was a daily gesture that required no acknowledgement, but which he found, quietly, to be one of the more decent things he'd encountered in recent months. He poured a cup and sat and looked at the water until it was time to go back inside. He returned to the city on a Sunday. He had 3 messages from David Park and 1 from Elena Voss. He read them in the car on the way from the garage to his apartment. David Park's messages covered the Securities Commission timeline. The formal investigation had produced preliminary findings. The findings had been transmitted to Hale Industries' legal team with a standard response window, and the institutional investors' legal representatives had filed a formal breach of fiduciary duty claim that would move separately through the civil courts, but would be procedurally accelerated by the commission findings. Elena's message was shorter. It said, "The AG's office found the earlier transaction. They're looking at it as part of a pattern." He sent her a brief acknowledgement. He sent David Park 3 questions about the procedural timeline for the civil claim. He went upstairs. He unpacked and made dinner. The formal Securities Commission findings were published in October. They were comprehensive and technically precise, and described, in the neutral language of regulatory authority, a pattern of acquisitions structured to circumvent disclosure requirements, with specific identification of 4 transactions where the above-market pricing had resulted in a material benefit to a connected party at the expense of the company's equity investors. The findings concluded with a list of corrective measures required and a schedule of administrative penalties. The penalties were not individually catastrophic for an entity of Hale Industries' scale. What was catastrophic was the forensic picture the findings painted and the civil litigation it enabled. The institutional investors' claim, filed 2 days after the findings were published, sought recovery of the $22 million differential plus damages. The claim named Dominic Hale personally alongside the corporate entity. Hale Industries' listed parent entity declined 24% over 3 days. The AG's office issued a public statement confirming that its preliminary inquiry into Ashworth Capital had been elevated to a formal investigation. The statement named Senator Victor Ashworth and described the scope of the investigation as encompassing fiduciary obligations related to the Crestline Development Group Incorporation and an earlier related transaction. Senator Ashworth's press conference that afternoon was the most uncomfortable public appearance Nathan had observed in several years of watching people manage difficult situations publicly. The senator stood at a podium with the careful posture of a man who had been in public life for 22 years and knew exactly how to stand when he was losing, which was to stand very straight and speak very slowly and use complete sentences at all times. He expressed his full cooperation with the investigation. He noted that the investigation was preliminary. He did not take questions. He announced 3 days later that he would not be seeking re-election. Nathan read the announcement over coffee on a Tuesday morning. He set his cup down and looked at the street below his window. A courier was locking a bicycle to a railing outside the building across the street, with the efficient movements of a person who has performed the same action several hundred times. A woman in a yellow coat was waiting for someone by the door of the coffee shop, checking her phone with the specific quality of attention that indicated the person was late. He thought, without particular emotional content, about the gala on November the 14th. He thought about the service corridor door and the angle of the shot and the fraction of a second in which he had processed the trajectory and moved his body. He thought about the specific quality of the sound in the room in the half-second after the shot, which was a quality he had never heard outside of operational contexts and which he had not thought about since he'd woken in the hospital. And he thought about Serena standing there with the white wine glass. He picked up his coffee cup and finished the coffee, and rinsed the cup and put it in the drying rack. He had one more thing to do. It was not, strictly speaking, part of the professional project. It was a personal administrative matter, the kind that had been waiting on a shelf in the back of his mind since the morning in rehabilitation, when he had opened a new note titled Professional Projects and begun to write. And he had left it until last, because it was the least complex element and required nothing from the regulatory machinery, or from Elena's forensics, or from David Park's precise legal architecture. It required only Nathan himself. He called his accountant that morning and instructed a series of changes to his personal financial structure. He dissolved the subsidiary arrangement through which the security contract with Senator Ashworth's office had historically been processed, which was technically already inactive given the expiration of the contract, but which he preferred to close formally rather than allow to expire by default. He consolidated 2 investment accounts that had been separately maintained for operational reasons that no longer applied. He reviewed and confirmed the continuation of a specific personal insurance arrangement that he had established 3 years ago and which contained a clause that he had included at the time as a standard risk management provision and which he had never had occasion to use and was now confident he would never need. He was not a man who left loose ends. He drafted 1 communication. It was addressed to Serena, and it was short, which suited the purpose, which was not to communicate anything substantive, but simply to close a file. And he had written longer versions and deleted them. The longer versions had contained explanations, which were not appropriate because explanations implied a reader who needed to understand. And Serena understood precisely what had happened and why. The longer versions had also, in their early drafts, contained something that resembled emotion, which was accurate in a technical sense, but irrelevant to the purpose of the communication. What he sent was 3 sentences. The first sentence noted that he hoped she was well, which was true in the sense that he had no specific interest in her being unwell. The second sentence observed that he had followed with interest the regulatory developments of the previous 6 months and trusted that she had competent legal representation guiding her through the process, which she presumably did, given the family resources available. The third sentence said, "I took a bullet for you. I want you to understand that I have no regret about that decision, because it was mine to make. What I do not intend to carry forward for any further period is the cost of the decisions that were not mine." He read it once. He sent it. He did not wait for a response. He opened a new document on his laptop and began writing the business plan for the firm's next phase. He had been thinking about it since the beach. He had the broad architecture clear in his mind. The practice would be organized around 3 service lines, which were risk intelligence, financial forensics consulting in partnership with specialists like Elena, and regulatory compliance monitoring for corporate clients who needed ongoing oversight rather than reactive crisis management. He had identified 2 potential hires from his existing professional network. One of them, a former Securities Commission analyst who had left the regulatory side to build a private practice, the other a junior associate from David Park's firm who had, in the course of the previous 6 months, demonstrated a quality of analytical precision that Nathan found rare enough to be worth recruiting. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping. The plan was detailed and specific, and it had, in the architecture of its service model, the particular character of something designed by a person who has recently been given a very thorough practical demonstration of exactly how corporate fraud works, which is to say it was more useful than most plans of its kind. At noon, he stopped and went downstairs and walked to the coffee shop on the corner. He stood in the short queue, which moved at the pace of a coffee shop queue in a city that has decided that the quality of its coffee is not a subject on which speed should be prioritized, and looked at the menu board with the detached attention of someone who already knows what they're ordering, but looks at the menu anyway, out of a general habit of observing things. The person in front of him ordered something complicated, and was told the machine making it was having a moment. They said fine, They'd wait. What the barista behind the counter, a young man with the particular composure of someone who had heard this machine described as having a moment several times this week, said it wouldn't be long, and offered them a seat. Nathan ordered black coffee. The barista made it immediately and handed it across with the economical competence of someone who appreciated that not everyone needed a complicated relationship with their beverage. Nathan said thank you and meant it, and went back upstairs. What he sat at his desk with the coffee and the business plan and the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon in October when the light comes in at an angle that makes everything in the room look like it has been considered. His shoulder was fine. His lungs were at full capacity. His mind was where it had always been most at home, which was in the middle of a complex problem with a clear analytical framework and a set of decisions that required making. Of course, the Hale Industries civil claim would run for another 12 to 18 months through the courts. The AG investigation into Ashworth Capital would proceed at its own pace. These were processes now, self-sustaining and independent of Nathan's participation, managed by institutions that were specifically designed to manage them. He had provided the input. He had verified that the architecture was sound. He had taken the necessary professional steps to ensure that his own exposure was properly managed. The rest of it would happen whether he watched it or not. He pulled the business plan back onto the screen. He scrolled to the section on the firm's service positioning and reread the paragraph he'd written about the specific gap in the corporate risk market that the new model was designed to fill. He made 2 edits, small ones, adjustments to language that sharpened the precision of the argument, but he read it again. He decided it was accurate and moved to the next section. Outside his window, the city continued without any particular acknowledgement of the fact that one of its more quietly significant corporate investigations had been assembled at a desk in this apartment by a man in a gray sweater who was now making revisions to a business plan and drinking black coffee from the corner shop. The delivery truck was gone from the building across the street. Zat, the woman in the yellow coat, had either found her person or given up on them. She was no longer at the coffee shop door. The day was moving in the direction of late afternoon, the light flattening and cooling in the way that October afternoons do. Nathan finished his coffee and kept working. At 4:15, his phone showed a message from Elena Voss. It said, "Formal findings on Ashworth Capital expected within 60 days per my AG contact. The earlier transaction is included in the scope. Look, you should know." He looked at the message for a moment. He typed back, "Noted. Thank you." He set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the middle distance for approximately 10 seconds. Then he picked the phone back up and opened his contacts and found the number for the former Securities Commission analyst he was considering hiring. He had been putting off the outreach for 2 weeks for no specific reason, and a small item of professional procrastination that he recognized as such and had no particular defense for. He dialed. The analyst answered on the 3rd ring. Her name was Diane Cho, and she was 41, and she had left the commission after 14 years, a tenure that Nathan had studied carefully because the specific manner of a departure from a regulatory body told you a great deal about the person's relationship to institutional authority, in which was a quality he needed to understand in anyone he worked closely with. Diane Cho had left because she'd been passed over for a division head appointment in favor of a politically connected candidate with half her regulatory experience, which was a departure type that Nathan categorized as principled exit, meaning she had left because the institution had failed to meet her standard, not because she had failed to meet its. But she was now running a small compliance consulting practice that was competent, but by Nathan's assessment of its public output, operating below the ceiling of what she was capable of. He introduced himself. She said she knew who he was. He said he suspected she might. He said he was building a firm with a specific service model and that he wanted to have a conversation about whether she'd be interested in being part of it. And she said she'd been wondering when someone would call her about something like that. They scheduled a meeting for the following week. He put the phone down and picked up his pen and went back to the business plan. Outside the window, a light came on in the building across the street in a room on the 3rd floor where someone had left the curtains open. He could see, through the window, the partial outline of a bookcase and the edge of a desk, and the warm, a specific light of a lamp being turned on in the late afternoon. The small, unremarkable gesture of a person making their space ready for the evening. Nathan looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the page. He wrote the firm's name at the top of the plan in plain print. Cole Risk and Compliance Advisory. It was not a name that required further consideration. It was accurate, and it was his, and it had the specific, unfussy character of something that didn't need to announce itself. He underlined it once. He turned the page and kept going.